The moment she laughed at the envelope in my hand, I knew she had no idea how expensive that smile was about to become. The heavy oak doors of the Homeowners Association clubhouse swung open with a slow creak as I stepped inside carrying nothing except a plain brown envelope tucked beneath my arm. The room smelled of freshly brewed coffee, polished wood, and the faint scent of new carpet that always seemed to linger after board meetings. Around the long conference table sat a dozen board members flipping through financial reports while quiet conversations echoed beneath the high ceiling. At the far end of the room sat Susan Whitmore, the 55-year-old president of the Homeowners Association, wearing a perfectly pressed navy blazer over a pearl-white blouse. She looked up the moment I entered, leaned back comfortably in her chair, and smiled the way people smile when they believe they already know how a conversation will end. I returned the smile without saying a word. Outside the tall clubhouse windows I could see the peaceful lake reflecting the morning sunlight, carefully trimmed lawns stretching across the subdivision, and families walking along sidewalks that crossed land my grandfather had once ridden on horseback decades before any of these homes had existed. Nobody inside that room noticed where my eyes had wandered because everyone was watching the envelope instead. One of the board members joked that I must finally be delivering another complaint about noise or parking. Another quietly laughed. Susan folded her hands together and welcomed me with the confidence of someone accustomed to controlling every meeting she attended. She invited me to take a seat, thanked me for coming, and assured everyone the board always appreciated hearing concerns from neighboring landowners. The word neighboring almost made me smile again. I remained standing beside the conference table while the air conditioner hummed softly overhead and the smell of coffee drifted across the room. My heartbeat never changed. Months earlier, I might have felt nervous walking into a room filled with people who believed they controlled everything around them. That morning, I felt something completely different. I felt patient. I placed the brown envelope on the polished wooden table and slowly slid it toward Susan. She glanced at the return address, raised one eyebrow, and casually opened the seal without the slightest hint of concern. Around the table, several board members continued reviewing spreadsheets, hardly paying attention anymore. Then she unfolded the first page. Her confident smile paused. She turned to the second page. The room became noticeably quieter. By the time she reached the attached commercial appraisal and revised lease schedule, every conversation had stopped completely. One board member quietly removed his reading glasses and leaned closer. Another slowly reached for the supporting documents clipped behind the cover letter. No one laughed anymore. Susan looked back up at me, her expression calm but noticeably different from only a few seconds earlier. She asked whether the paperwork had been delivered by mistake. I gently shook my head. The clubhouse had not been sold. It had not been condemned. It had not even changed locations. The only thing that had changed was the truth everyone had overlooked for decades. Beneath the foundation of the building where they held every meeting, collected every membership payment, and approved every neighborhood rule sat land that my family had legally owned for generations. They believed they owned the building. They never stopped to ask who owned the ground beneath it. What nobody inside that room knew was that I had spent the previous several months quietly reading old deeds, forgotten lease agreements, county archives, and handwritten notes left behind by my grandfather, and every single page had been leading me to that exact moment. My name is Logan Bennett, and until the day I inherited my grandfather's ranch, I never imagined that a single piece of paper could quietly reshape an entire community. The property stretched across 1,500 acres of rolling Texas pasture, shaded by towering live oak trees and crossed by shallow creeks that reflected the evening sky like polished glass. Every fence line carried a story. Every weathered cedar post had been set by hands long before I was born. The old ranch house still smelled of cedar beams, leather saddles, and black coffee brewed before sunrise, while the small cabin overlooking the lake remained exactly as my grandfather had left it, complete with faded maps folded neatly inside an oak cabinet beside his writing desk. I had spent most of my adult life working as a commercial real estate analyst in Dallas, visiting the ranch only during holidays and family gatherings. When my grandfather passed away, I returned expecting months of repairs, paperwork, and quiet memories. Instead, I inherited far more than land. I inherited responsibilities that reached back through generations. During my first weeks on the property, I walked nearly every corner of the ranch with an old notebook my grandfather had filled with careful observations over decades. Some pages listed rainfall totals. Others described fence repairs or cattle movements. Between those practical notes were small reminders written in his unmistakable handwriting. Never remove the brass survey marker near the lake. Always verify county records before signing anything. The clubhouse lease expires eventually. That final sentence stopped me. I remembered the neighborhood clubhouse sitting beside the lake near the southern entrance of the property. But I had always assumed it belonged entirely to the Homeowners Association. Like everyone else, I believed the land beneath it had been sold years ago along with the surrounding development. My grandfather had never spoken much about it, and I never thought to ask. The clubhouse itself looked permanent, with its stone walls, wide front porch, carefully maintained gardens, and busy parking lot filled during weekend events. Families gathered there for holiday celebrations, neighborhood meetings, and community dinners. Children laughed beside the walking paths while ducks drifted across the lake every afternoon. It seemed impossible that anything about the place could still involve our ranch. Even so, my grandfather had never written unnecessary notes. Every sentence inside that notebook existed for a reason. Curious, I unlocked the old filing cabinet standing beside his desk. The metal drawers slid open with a dry scraping sound, releasing the familiar scent of aged paper and cedar wood. Inside were neatly labeled folders containing warranty deeds, tax records, surveys, lease agreements, handwritten correspondence, and county filings preserved with remarkable care. I spent evening after evening reading through documents while rain tapped softly against the cabin windows and crickets filled the darkness outside. Slowly, one date connected to another, one signature led to another document, and one forgotten agreement quietly challenged everything I thought I knew about the property surrounding the clubhouse. By the time the first rays of sunlight reached the lake each morning, I had begun to realize that the envelope I would eventually carry into the Homeowners Association meeting had not been created overnight. It had started decades earlier, one carefully preserved document at a time, waiting patiently for someone willing to read every page instead of trusting every assumption. The more carefully I studied my grandfather's records, the more I realized the truth had never been hidden. It had simply been ignored because everyone had become comfortable believing the same story for too many years. The oldest lease agreement inside the filing cabinet had been signed nearly 3 decades earlier when the subdivision was nothing more than a proposal drawn on engineering paper. My grandfather had agreed to lease a small section of land beside the lake so the future neighborhood could build a community clubhouse. The agreement was surprisingly simple. The Homeowners Association would lease the land while my family retained full ownership beneath it. The building could belong to the association, but the ground would always remain part of the ranch. The rent had been modest because the neighborhood was still small, and my grandfather believed helping responsible neighbors build a strong community benefited everyone. As I continued reading, another detail immediately caught my attention. The lease contained a fixed expiration date along with clear language explaining that any renewal required written approval from both parties before a new term could begin. Curious, I searched through every folder inside the cabinet expecting to find a renewal agreement signed years later. I found correspondence, tax receipts, maintenance notes, insurance documents, and county filings, but no renewed lease. Thinking I might have overlooked something, I visited the county recorder's office and requested certified copies of every recorded document related to the property. The quiet reading room smelled of paper, polished wood, and old books while clerks carefully retrieved archived files from secure storage. Hour after hour I compared legal descriptions, recording dates, signatures, and parcel maps. Every document confirmed the same conclusion. The original lease had expired years earlier, and no replacement agreement had ever been recorded. The ownership of the land had never changed. The Homeowners Association continued using the property exactly as before, but legally the arrangement had never been updated. I hired a respected real estate attorney experienced in commercial land leases to review everything before drawing any conclusions. After several days of studying the files, he closed the final binder, looked directly at me, and quietly said that my grandfather had protected the ranch remarkably well. According to the documents, my family still owned the land beneath the clubhouse, the parking lot, portions of the walking trail, and part of the landscaped entrance surrounding the building. The attorney explained that ownership and occupancy were two completely different legal concepts, and many people confused them until disputes forced everyone to read the paperwork more carefully. He recommended obtaining an independent survey and a commercial appraisal before contacting the Homeowners Association. Within weeks, licensed surveyors located the original brass markers exactly where my grandfather's notebook said they would be. The new measurements aligned perfectly with decades of recorded plats, while the commercial appraisal reflected how dramatically property values around the lake had increased since the original lease had been signed. Standing beside the water one quiet evening, I watched the clubhouse lights shimmer across the surface while families enjoyed another neighborhood gathering completely unaware of the history beneath their feet. I did not feel anger watching them laugh together. Most of them had no idea the lease had quietly expired years before. My concern was not with the homeowners. My concern was with the people responsible for managing the association, because someone had continued acting as though temporary permission had somehow transformed into permanent ownership without ever asking whether the documents still supported that belief. My attorney suggested that we give the Homeowners Association every reasonable opportunity to correct the situation before taking any formal legal action, and I agreed because that approach sounded exactly like something my grandfather would have done. We assembled a complete package containing the certified survey, the recorded deed, the original lease agreement, the county title records, and the commercial appraisal prepared by an independent valuation firm. Every page had been organized in chronological order, making it impossible to misunderstand how the property had been managed for decades. Before delivering anything, I walked once more along the lake at sunrise, listening to ducks glide across the still water while the clubhouse lights slowly faded beneath the growing daylight. The air smelled of damp grass, cedar, and fresh coffee drifting from the clubhouse kitchen, where volunteers were preparing for another neighborhood breakfast. Families arrived carrying folding chairs, children laughed near the walking trail, and retirees gathered beneath the covered pavilion to watch the morning unfold. Looking at those ordinary moments reminded me why I had remained patient throughout this entire process. The homeowners were not the reason the paperwork had been neglected. They had simply trusted the people elected to protect the association's interests. Later that morning, I requested a private meeting with Susan Whitmore. She welcomed me into her office with the same polished confidence she carried into every board meeting, offering coffee before asking what had brought me there. I placed the organized binder on her desk and explained, as calmly as I could, that I believed the association needed to review several historical property records concerning the clubhouse. Susan smiled politely and assured me that the Homeowners Association had occupied the building for decades without a single ownership question. She explained that countless board members had managed the property before her and that every financial report listed the clubhouse as a community asset. I quietly agreed that the building itself served the community extremely well, but then I opened the binder to the recorded lease agreement signed by my grandfather. I pointed to the language stating that the association leased the land while ownership remained with my family, then showed her the expiration date followed by the county records confirming that no renewal had ever been recorded. Her expression shifted slightly, but only for a moment. She closed the binder, thanked me for bringing the documents, and suggested that older paperwork often became confusing over time. She assured me the association's attorneys had always handled legal matters appropriately and believed there was probably a simple explanation. I asked whether she could provide the recorded renewal agreement or any document transferring ownership of the land beneath the clubhouse. Instead of answering directly, she explained that she would have the board review everything during its next meeting. I left the office feeling neither disappointed nor encouraged because I had expected exactly that response. During the following weeks, I received a courteous letter acknowledging receipt of my documents, but the association maintained that it believed its long-standing use of the property supported its position while promising additional review. At the same time, my attorney continued working with the title examiner, county recorder, licensed surveyor, and commercial appraiser to verify every remaining detail. Each independent professional reached the same conclusion without hesitation. The lease had expired, the ownership had never changed, and every original brass survey marker still matched the recorded boundary descriptions. Standing beside the old ranch gate one cool evening, I realized the conversation was no longer about opinions. It had become a question of whether written history would finally be allowed to speak louder than comfortable assumptions. The board meeting arrived 2 weeks later, and I could feel the tension before I even opened the clubhouse doors. The familiar scent of fresh coffee and polished wood filled the room, but the relaxed conversations I remembered from previous meetings had disappeared. Every seat around the conference table was occupied, and several homeowners stood quietly along the back wall after hearing rumors that important legal matters would be discussed. Susan Whitmore greeted me with professional courtesy, although the confidence she had displayed during our first conversation seemed noticeably more restrained. My attorney sat beside me carrying 3 organized binders containing the certified survey, the recorded lease, the title examination, the commercial appraisal, and the county records we had spent months assembling. Before anyone spoke, Susan informed the board that the association had completed its own review with outside legal counsel. She acknowledged that historical property documents required further discussion, but maintained that the association believed its long history of occupying the clubhouse created a reasonable expectation that existing arrangements could continue. My attorney calmly thanked her for addressing the matter and then requested permission to present the verified documentation. One by one, he displayed the original recorded lease, highlighting the clause stating that ownership of the land remained with my family while the association leased only the property beneath the clubhouse and surrounding improvements. Next came the expiration date, followed by certified county records showing no recorded renewal agreement after the original lease ended. Finally, the licensed commercial appraisal appeared on the presentation screen, illustrating how dramatically land values around the lake had increased over the past several decades. The room became remarkably quiet. Several board members leaned forward to study the documents more carefully, while others exchanged uncertain glances after realizing they were seeing many of these records for the very first time. One homeowner politely asked whether the association had ever received written permission to continue occupying the property after the lease expired. Susan admitted she had inherited the files from previous boards and had always understood the clubhouse to be a permanent community asset. Another board member asked whether anyone had searched the county recorder's office for a renewal agreement before. No one answered immediately. The silence said enough. My attorney explained that ownership of a building and ownership of the land beneath it could exist separately under a lease arrangement, but when the lease expired without renewal, the legal relationship required attention. He emphasized that I had not come to demand immediate changes or disrupt the neighborhood. Instead, I wanted to establish a lawful commercial lease reflecting current market conditions while allowing the clubhouse to continue serving the community. Then he placed the updated lease proposal on the conference table. The revised rental amount reflected the independent commercial appraisal and was approximately 5 times higher than the rent established decades earlier, when the surrounding area had been little more than open pasture. Several people quietly calculated the difference in their notebooks. Although the increase appeared significant compared with the original agreement, the appraiser's report demonstrated that it remained consistent with comparable commercial land leases throughout the region. Susan slowly reviewed every page before looking up at me with a thoughtful expression. She asked whether I would consider negotiating certain operational details if the board accepted the legal findings regarding ownership. I nodded without hesitation. My goal had never been to create hardship. I simply wanted the same respect for documented property rights that my grandfather had carefully preserved throughout his lifetime. As the meeting concluded, the board voted to postpone a final decision until its attorneys completed one last review of the newly presented records. But for the first time since the story began, nobody questioned who legally owned the land beneath the clubhouse. The only question remaining was how the association would respond now that every assumption had finally been replaced by documented fact. The following month unfolded much more quietly than I expected, and that silence turned out to be far more meaningful than another heated board meeting ever could have been. The Homeowners Association retained a nationally recognized real estate law firm to perform an independent review of every document we had presented. At the same time, their attorneys requested certified copies directly from the county recorder instead of relying on records already in our possession. I welcomed that decision because the truth never becomes weaker when more people verify it. During those weeks, I returned to the familiar rhythm of ranch life. Every morning began with the smell of fresh coffee drifting across the porch while mist hovered above the lake beside the clubhouse. I repaired fences, checked cattle, and walked the same trails my grandfather had followed for decades. Each afternoon I passed the brass survey marker near the shoreline, brushing away loose grass exactly as he had taught me years earlier. The marker had become a quiet reminder that boundaries do not disappear simply because people stop paying attention to them. One cool Friday afternoon my attorney called and asked me to meet him at his office before sunset. When I arrived, several thick folders covered the conference table, each carrying the logo of the Homeowners Association's outside law firm. He smiled before saying a single word. Their attorneys had independently confirmed every material fact contained in our records. The original lease had been properly executed decades earlier. The lease had clearly identified my family's continuing ownership of the land beneath the clubhouse. The expiration date was accurate. No recorded renewal agreement existed in the county archives. No deed transferring ownership of the land had ever been filed. Even the legal descriptions prepared by their own survey consultant matched the licensed survey we had commissioned months before. The evidence now came from both sides instead of only one. A week later, the board scheduled a special meeting attended by nearly every homeowner in the subdivision. The atmosphere inside the clubhouse felt entirely different from the first meeting I had attended. Instead of whispered jokes and quiet confidence, people carried notebooks, copies of legal summaries, and genuine questions. Susan Whitmore opened the meeting by explaining that the association's independent legal review had reached the same conclusion as the county records. She acknowledged that previous boards had simply continued operating under the assumption that the original lease remained in effect without ever confirming whether it had legally been renewed. There was no attempt to shift blame onto homeowners. There was no dramatic argument. Only an honest explanation supported by verified documentation. My attorney then reviewed the proposed commercial lease once again, explaining how the revised rental amount had been calculated using current market data prepared by the independent appraiser rather than arbitrary figures. Although the new rent was approximately 5 times greater than the amount established decades earlier, the comparison reflected nearly 30 years of changing land values surrounding the lake and the clubhouse. Several homeowners asked thoughtful questions about budgeting, reserve funds, and future planning. Others admitted they had never realized the association owned the building while leasing the land beneath it. By the end of the evening, the discussion had shifted away from denying ownership and toward finding the most responsible way to move forward. As I stepped outside after the meeting, the last rays of sunlight shimmered across the lake beside the clubhouse, and a cool breeze carried the familiar scent of cedar, freshly cut grass, and calm water. Looking back at the building, I realized nothing about the land had actually changed. The only thing that had changed was that everyone now understood the truth that had been patiently waiting inside those old documents all along. Over the next several weeks, the atmosphere around the neighborhood changed in ways I never expected. The conversations were no longer about whether my family owned the land beneath the clubhouse. That question had already been answered by every attorney, surveyor, title examiner, and county record anyone could locate. Instead, every discussion focused on responsibility. Homeowners wanted to know why a lease that had been so carefully written decades earlier had quietly expired without anyone noticing. They wanted to understand why every board after my grandfather's generation had simply assumed the arrangement continued forever without verifying a single document. The board scheduled another public meeting, and this time nearly every chair inside the clubhouse was filled before sunset. The familiar smell of fresh coffee drifted through the room while evening light reflected across the lake outside the tall windows. Susan Whitmore stood before the homeowners with noticeably different posture than she had carried only a few months earlier. The confidence that once came from certainty had been replaced by the steadiness of someone finally willing to face uncomfortable facts. She began by summarizing the findings prepared by the association's independent legal team, confirming once again that the land beneath the clubhouse remained part of my family's ranch and that the original lease had expired years before without renewal. No one interrupted her. The room remained remarkably quiet because everyone had already seen the documents themselves. Then the association's attorney explained the proposed commercial lease in detail. He walked through the independent appraisal, regional commercial rental comparisons, maintenance responsibilities, insurance requirements, future adjustment provisions, and renewal procedures designed to ensure that the same mistake could never happen again. Although the revised rent was significantly higher than the amount established decades earlier, every figure reflected current market conditions instead of arbitrary numbers. One homeowner stood and asked the question many people had clearly been thinking. He asked why I had not simply demanded that the clubhouse be removed if the land legally belonged to my family. I smiled before answering because I had considered that question many times myself. I explained that the clubhouse had become an important part of the neighborhood. Children learned to swim at the lake during summer events. Families celebrated birthdays, graduations, and holidays inside that building. None of those memories deserved to disappear because of paperwork someone else had neglected. My goal had never been to erase the community. My goal had always been to restore respect for the agreement my grandfather originally made in good faith. The room remained silent for several seconds before scattered applause slowly spread across the audience. It was not applause celebrating higher rent. It was appreciation for choosing cooperation over conflict. Later that evening, the board voted to approve the new lease agreement, authorize the updated rental payments, and implement annual legal reviews of every significant property document owned by the association. Susan signed the agreement first, followed by me and our respective attorneys, while a county notary completed the final acknowledgments. As I stepped outside carrying the same brown envelope that had begun this entire journey, the cool evening breeze carried the scent of cedar, fresh grass, and calm water across the ranch. The envelope no longer contained uncertainty. It now held a properly executed lease supported by accurate records, mutual understanding, and a promise that the land my grandfather protected would never again be managed through assumptions instead of truth. Life settled into a new rhythm after the lease agreement was signed, but the consequences of years of overlooked paperwork continued unfolding in ways no one had expected. The first monthly financial report prepared under the new lease forced the Homeowners Association to examine every expense with far greater care than before. The updated rental payment reflected the true market value of the land beneath the clubhouse, and while it surprised many residents at first, it also revealed something much more important. For years, the association had relied upon an arrangement that no longer legally existed instead of planning responsibly for the future. Rather than creating panic, the board responded with remarkable transparency. Every homeowner received a detailed explanation describing how the independent appraisal had been completed, why the lease required updating, and what steps would be taken to strengthen financial oversight moving forward. The atmosphere inside the clubhouse gradually changed from frustration to cooperation. Committee meetings became longer, but they also became more productive. Reserve studies were updated. Outside legal reviews became mandatory before every major property decision. Historical records were digitized and backed up in multiple locations so future board members would never inherit incomplete files again. One afternoon, Susan Whitmore asked if we could meet beside the lake after the monthly board meeting. The evening air carried the familiar scent of cedar, fresh-cut grass, and calm water while ducks drifted quietly across the shoreline where my grandfather had once marked the original property boundary. Susan stood looking across the lake for several moments before speaking. She admitted that when she first opened the brown envelope, she believed it contained another routine complaint from a neighboring landowner. She had never imagined it would uncover decades of overlooked history. She also acknowledged that every board she had inherited simply accepted previous assumptions without verifying the underlying documents. I appreciated her honesty because accepting responsibility often requires more courage than winning an argument. I told her that my grandfather always believed good neighbors solved difficult problems by respecting both people and paperwork. She smiled quietly and said she wished she had met him. As autumn slowly gave way to winter, the clubhouse continued hosting holiday dinners, children's events, charity fundraisers, and neighborhood celebrations exactly as it always had. The building never closed. Families continued gathering beneath the same stone walls overlooking the lake, but now everyone understood the legal relationship that allowed those traditions to continue. Every monthly rental payment arrived on schedule under the terms of the new agreement, accompanied by courteous correspondence from the association instead of uncertainty. Even the old brass survey marker near the shoreline gained unexpected attention after the story spread through the community. Residents often stopped to read the small historical plaque the board installed nearby explaining the importance of preserving accurate property records for future generations. Standing beside the ranch gate one crisp December morning, I watched sunlight reflect across the clubhouse windows while the same brown envelope rested safely inside my truck, now containing a fully executed lease signed by everyone involved. I realized the greatest change had never been the increased rent. The real change was that trust had finally been rebuilt on documented truth instead of comfortable assumptions. And because of that, both the ranch and the neighborhood now had a stronger future than either one could have achieved alone. Nearly a year after I carried that plain brown envelope into the clubhouse, the entire property looked exactly as it always had, yet everything about it had quietly changed. The same morning sunlight reflected across the lake, children still raced along the walking trails after school, neighbors gathered beneath the covered pavilion for community events, and the clubhouse remained the heart of the subdivision. The difference was invisible to anyone driving past for the first time. Hidden beneath every sidewalk, every flower bed, and every carefully maintained lawn was something far more valuable than landscaping. There was clarity. Every property description had been verified. Every lease obligation had been documented. Every renewal date had been entered into permanent association records. The confusion that had quietly survived for decades would never be allowed to return. I often found myself standing beside the old brass survey marker near the shoreline just before sunset. The cool breeze still carried the familiar scent of cedar, fresh-cut grass, and calm water exactly as it had when my grandfather first showed me that weathered marker many years earlier. Back then, I never understood why he insisted we stop beside it every visit. Now I understood perfectly. The marker had never been important because of the metal itself. It mattered because it represented truth that remained unchanged whether people noticed it or not. One afternoon, Susan Whitmore stopped by the ranch after finishing another board meeting. She carried no legal binders, no financial reports, and no carefully prepared speeches. Instead, she handed me a framed photograph taken during the subdivision's annual community picnic. Families smiled beside the clubhouse while children played near the lake, and in the distance the old ranch stretched peacefully toward the horizon. She told me the board had decided to hang a matching photograph inside the clubhouse alongside a brief history explaining how cooperation, accurate records, and respect for lawful ownership had preserved both the neighborhood and the ranch. I thanked her sincerely because that decision meant more than any public apology ever could. It meant future generations would understand why the documents mattered before another misunderstanding could grow into another dispute. As the seasons continued changing, the revised lease simply became another ordinary part of community life. Monthly payments arrived exactly as scheduled. Annual reviews took place without disagreement. The board maintained complete financial transparency. Homeowners asked informed questions, and every significant property decision required careful legal review before implementation. The increased rent that had once shocked everyone gradually became an accepted business expense because it reflected the true value of the land beneath the clubhouse rather than outdated numbers left behind by another generation. Looking back, many people assumed the most important moment in this story was when the rent increased fivefold. They were wrong. The most important moment happened long before that, when my grandfather placed a lease agreement, a deed, and a handwritten notebook into an old filing cabinet instead of throwing them away. He understood something I only appreciated years later. Buildings grow older. Board members change. Neighborhoods expand. Assumptions come and go. But carefully preserved truth has a remarkable way of waiting patiently until someone is willing to read it. Every time I drive through the ranch gate at sunrise and see the clubhouse standing peacefully beside the lake, I smile because nothing was taken away from the community. It simply learned to stand on a stronger foundation built upon honesty instead of habit. My grandfather once wrote a single sentence at the bottom of one yellowed notebook page, and today I finally understand exactly what he meant. Ownership is never protected by anger. It is protected by patience, good records, and the quiet certainty that the truth does not become less true simply because people forget where the boundary begins.